A man can build a fortress with his own two hands, stone by stone, plank by plank, until the walls are high enough to keep the world at bay. But it takes another's trust to make it a home. This is the story of how a house built for one learned the shape of two, not in the fury of a storm, but in the quiet sun-dusted spaces between heartbeats, in the careful question of a hand reaching across the dark. This is how love is lit, not like a wildfire, but like a lamp in a window, a steady flame promising warmth against the coming night. Silas Kent measured his days in the sharp ring of his hammer and the predictable arc of the sun. His homestead, nestled a mile from the dusty main street of Redemption, was a testament to order. The woodpile was stacked, just so the tools in his smithy hung in a graduated line from largest to smallest, and the single plate, fork, and cup he used for his supper were washed and dried before the last light bled from the sky. Loneliness was a familiar weight, a silence that had settled into the very grain of the floorboards. It lived in the second chair at his small kitchen table, perpetually empty. It echoed in the neat, untouched side of his bed, the covers pulled taut as a drumskin. He was a competent man, his hands calloused and sure, capable of shaping raw iron into a gate or a plowshare with equal precision. But gentleness was a language he had long forgotten how to speak. He moved through his life with a stoic economy of motion, his words as sparse as the rain in a dry season. He listened, though. He listened to the shift of the wind in the cottonwoods, the complaint of a loose hinge, the scuttling of a mouse in the wall. He was a man who noticed things, and what he noticed most was the profound, aching quiet of a life lived entirely for oneself. Each evening he would light a single lamp, its golden glow pushing back the shadows, but doing little to warm the hollow space inside him. The light flickered over a jawline, set in a permanent state of vigilance, a habit from a life he'd left far behind. He would sit, his hands resting on his knees, and the only sound would be the slow tick of the mantel clock, counting out the seconds of his solitude. He had built this place to be a sanctuary, a place of peace. But peace, he was learning, was not the same as belonging. Eliza Mayhew stepped down from the stagecoach, her grip tight on the handle of her worn carpetbag. Dust settled on the hem of her gray dress, another layer on a garment that had seen too many miles. She was a survivor, and survival had taught her to be perceptive. She read the town of Redemption in a single sweeping glance, the false fronts of the saloon and the general store, the stern face of the church, the women who paused to watch her, their expressions a mixture of pity and suspicion. She was supposed to be the new housekeeper at the boarding house, a position that promised a room of her own and a wage that would keep her. But the boarding house, she learned from the grim-faced parson who met her, was now a blackened pile of timbers, the victim of a lamp-oil fire 2 weeks prior. Her contract was ash, her future a puff of smoke. The parson, a man whose piety was matched only by his discomfort, wrung his hands. There is one possibility, a temporary arrangement you understand. He led her down the dusty road, away from the town center, toward a solitary homestead. Mr. Kent is an honorable man, a quiet man. He has a spare room. Eliza's pride chafed. To be foisted upon a stranger, to be an object of charity, it was the very thing she had traveled 1,000 miles to escape. But dignity was a luxury, and she needed a roof over her head. When Silas Kent opened his door, he was larger than she'd expected. A wall of a man, his face unreadable, his eyes a clear, steady gray. He listened to the parson's flustered explanation without a word, his gaze moving from the clergyman to Eliza. She met it squarely, lifting her chin. She would not be cowed. She saw the flicker of something in his expression, not pity, but a kind of weary recognition. He gave a curt nod. She can have the room at the back. The parson scurried away, relieved. Eliza stood on the threshold, the silence stretching between them. She was in his house, under his power. The thought sent a tremor of old fear through her. She drew a breath, her voice clear and steady. "The door to my room will have a lock, Mr. Kent, and I will have the key." He didn't blink. His gaze was direct, serious. "I'll fit one before sundown," he said. And in that simple, unquestioning agreement, a single fragile seed of trust was planted in the barren ground of her fear. The first days were a careful choreography of avoidance. Silas rose before dawn, the habit of a lifetime, and found his kitchen was no longer entirely his own. A woman's presence had subtly altered the landscape. There was a scent of lavender soap in the air, a shawl draped over the back of the empty chair, a small jar of wildflowers on the windowsill. It was unsettling. He was used to the rigid predictability of his solitude, and Eliza Mayhew was an unknown quantity, a disruption to the quiet order he had so carefully constructed. He moved around her as if she were a skittish doe, making no sudden movements, keeping his voice low and infrequent. He found himself watching her, though. He watched the efficient way she moved, her hands never idle. He saw the weariness in the line of her shoulders and the proud set of her jaw. He left for his smithy early and returned late, hoping to minimize the friction of their shared space. But the house was too small for them to remain strangers. One morning, he noticed her shivering in the pre-dawn chill. The next morning, he left a small stack of kindling and a box of matches by the hearth in the main room before he went out, a silent offering. He saw her trip on a floorboard near the pantry that had been loose for a year, a minor annoyance he had always just stepped over. That afternoon, he came in from the forge, knelt on the floor, and secured it with 3 perfectly sunk nails. He did not say a word about it, and neither did she. But the next day, a clean, folded square of linen appeared beside his wash basin. His. He noticed the way she held her mending basket, her fingers deft, but the thread she used thin and prone to snapping. Her one good dress was a map of careful repairs, each stitch a testament to her resilience. He would find himself at the forge, his mind drifting from the glowing iron in his tongs to the image of her head bent over her needlework in the fading light. This proximity was a strange and unwelcome complication. It was a splinter under the skin, a constant, low-grade ache of awareness. He felt a protective instinct stir within him, an old reflex he thought he had buried long ago. It was a dangerous feeling. Protection led to connection, and connection was a vulnerability he could not afford. And yet, when he poured his coffee in the morning, he found himself checking to see if she was awake, leaving the pot on the warmer side of the stove for her. It was a small, almost unconscious gesture, but it was a beginning. Eliza learned the rhythms of Silas Kent through sound. The heavy, reassuring tread of his boots on the porch, the distant, rhythmic clang of the hammer on the anvil, the quiet scrape of his chair as he sat for his evening meal. He was a man who took up space in the world, yet his presence in the house was almost spectral. He made himself small, erasing his own comfort for the sake of hers. She saw the gestures he thought were invisible, the kindling by the hearth, the solid thud of the repaired floorboard beneath her feet, the coffee pot left where it would stay warmest. These were not the flowery, empty promises of the men she had known. They were quiet, solid acts of consideration. They were a language she understood far better than words. Her fear, that tight knot in her chest, began to loosen its hold, thread by thread. She had survived by being wary, by trusting no one. But this silent, stoic man did not press. He did not pry. He simply was. One afternoon, while he was in town for supplies, she took one of his work shirts from the mending pile. It was sturdy twill, stained with soot and sweat, the cuff frayed almost to ruin. She sat in the quiet kitchen, the house feeling empty without the distant ring of his hammer, and she repaired it. Her stitches were small, and even a line of perfect order against the worn fabric. It was more than a chore. It was an answer, a gesture of her own. She folded it and left it on the seat of his chair at the table. When he returned, he saw it immediately. He stopped in the doorway, his large frame filling the space. He looked at the shirt, then at her. She was prepared for him to be angry, for him to see it as an intrusion. Instead, a flicker of something unreadable crossed his face. He picked up the shirt, his calloused thumb tracing the line of her stitches. "Thank you," he said. The two words were rough, as if unused. That evening, she dared a question. "What is it you're making?" she asked, nodding toward the smithy. He looked surprised by the directness of it. "A new hinge," he said, "for the church gate. Is it difficult?" He considered this for a long moment. "Everything is difficult until you learn the measure of it," he said. The heat, the weight, the strike. Eliza understood. She knew about measuring things. The heat of a man's temper, the weight of his expectations, the strike of his hand. But here, in this quiet house, the measures were different. They were in the space he left for her, in the respect he showed her closed door. She had established a boundary, and he had not only honored it, he had reinforced it, making it a place of safety, not a line of defense. The mended shirt was a brand on his skin. When he wore it, Silas could feel the faint pull of her stitches against his wrist, a constant, intimate reminder of her presence. He was a man who dealt in the tangible, the heft of steel, the grain of wood, the heat of the forge. But this, the delicate work of her hands on his garment, was something else entirely. It was a message, and it unsettled the foundations of the solitary life he had built. His watchfulness began to change. The habit of scanning a room for threats, a relic of his past, slowly transformed. Now he found himself scanning her face for signs of weariness, listening for the slight hesitation in her breath that signaled distress. Guardedness was shifting, melting into a strange, unfamiliar longing. He wanted to ease the permanent line of worry between her brows. He wanted to see her smile, a genuine smile, not the tight, polite curving of her lips she offered the parson or the grocer. The desire was a low, persistent hum beneath the surface of his thoughts. While in town for Ironstock, he walked past the mercantile. In the window, amongst the sacks of flour and bolts of calico, were spools of colored thread. He saw a deep blue, the color of a twilight sky, and thought of her eyes. He saw a forest green, the color of her shawl. He paused, his hand on the door, feeling like a fool. He was a blacksmith. What did he know of thread? But he went inside anyway. He bought a spool of sturdy, dark gray thread, the most practical color he could find, and a packet of new needles. He didn't hand them to her as a gift. That would have been too forward, too much like a courtship he had no right to initiate. Instead, he left the small paper-wrapped parcel on the kitchen table beside her mending basket while she was out gathering herbs. When he saw her later, she said nothing, but the new thread was already in use, its strong dark line a stark contrast to the flimsy stuff she'd used before. That afternoon, Mr. Thorne rode out from town. Thorne was a landowner, a man whose wealth gave him an air of slick entitlement. He'd seen Eliza at church and had made it his business to learn of her situation. He dismounted, his smile predatory, and addressed Eliza on the porch as if Silas wasn't even there, standing 10 feet away at the water pump. "A lady like you, all alone out here." "It isn't right," Thorne said, his eyes roaming over her. "I have a position in my own household, much more suitable." Eliza's back went rigid. "I am quite suitable here, thank you." Silas said nothing. He simply finished pumping the water, picked up the heavy bucket, and walked toward the porch. He didn't look at Thorne. He looked only at Eliza, his expression calm. He stopped beside her, his presence a silent, solid wall. He set the bucket down with a quiet thud. Thorne's smile faltered under the weight of that silence. He looked from Silas's impassive face to Eliza's closed one, muttered something about his kind offer, and retreated. Silas had not spoken a word, but he had made himself understood. he was standing with her. The encounter with Mr. Thorne had changed the air. It was no longer just the two of them in a quiet house. The world and its judgments were pressing in. Gossip, Eliza knew, was a weed that grew fastest in the soil of speculation. She was a single woman living under a single man's roof. Mr. Thorne's unwelcome interest had only served to highlight the impropriety of her situation in the eyes of the town. She saw it in the tightened lips of the baker's wife, heard it in the sudden silences that fell when she entered the general store. She was becoming a liability to the one man who had shown her unconditional respect. The parson's visit a few days later confirmed her fears. He sat stiffly in Silas's kitchen, clearing his throat and speaking of appearances and Christian duty. He suggested Eliza should take Mr. Thorne's offer, or perhaps move into the small room behind the church, a damp, cheerless space meant for storage. The choices he offered were not choices at all. They were cages of varying sizes. That evening, the silence in the house was heavier than usual. Eliza could not eat. The thought of being indebted to the smirking Mr. Thorne, or living on the church's charity, was a familiar, bitter taste in her mouth. She had not come all this way to trade one form of dependence for another. Silas watched her from across the small table, his gray eyes missing nothing. The lamplight carved shadows into the planes of his face, making him seem older, more weary than usual. Finally, he broke the silence, his voice low and steady. "There is another way." Eliza looked up, her heart a nervous bird in her ribs. "A marriage," he said, the words sitting strangely in the quiet room. He held up a hand before she could speak, his expression earnest, serious. "In name only. A piece of paper to satisfy the parson and keep men like Thorne away. Nothing would have to change between us. This would remain your room." He gestured with his head toward her door. "Your life would be your own. It would be an agreement. For your safety." He was offering her his name, the most profound protection he possessed, and asking for nothing in return. He was giving her all the power. The choice, he made clear, was entirely hers. He would not press her. He would not even look at her with expectation. He simply waited, his hands still on the table, his gaze fixed on the flickering lamp flame. She looked at this quiet, honorable man who mended floorboards and left kindling for her warmth. He was offering her not a cage, but a shield. A partnership built on respect, not possession. A home, not a debt. She thought of Thorne's leering smile and the parson's pity. Then she looked at Silas, who met her gaze without flinching. "Yes," she said, her voice a little stronger than a whisper. "I agree." A breath he didn't seem aware he was holding escaped him. "I will keep you safe, Eliza," he vowed, his voice rough with an emotion he did not name. She nodded, her own vow silent, but just as binding. "I know." The preacher's words were a dull murmur, the town's curious eyes a palpable weight on Silas's back. But the only thing he was aware of was the small, steady warmth of Eliza's hand in his. They stood before the parson in the small, sun-dusted church, the document that bound them sitting on the lectern. It felt unreal. A farmer, a blacksmith, now a husband. The title felt ill-fitting, a coat borrowed from another man. He said the words required of him, his voice a low rumble in the quiet space. He watched Eliza, her face pale but resolute, as she spoke her own vows in a clear, soft voice. It was a lie, of course, a practical arrangement. But as he looked at her, he felt a fierce, protective surge that was anything but practical. He would honor their agreement. Nothing would change. But as they walked back to the homestead, the silence between them different now, heavier with unspoken things, he knew it was a lie, too. Everything had changed. The house felt smaller that night. The single bed in his room, once a symbol of his solitude, was now a vast, contested territory. He had given her his name, but he would not presume to share her bed. He brought in the spare cot from the storeroom. "You take the bed," he said, his back to her as he set up the narrow cot in the corner. "It's your room now, by right." He heard her move behind him. "No," Eliza said softly. "This is foolish. There is no need for you to sleep on the floor like a dog." He turned. She stood near the bed, her arms crossed, her expression determined. "The bed is large enough. We are adults, Mr. Kent. Silas, it is just sleeping." It was more than that, and they both knew it. It was a landscape of intimacy he had no map for. But to refuse would be to insult her, to imply a lack of trust in him or in themselves. He gave a slow nod. He undressed in the shadows, down to his small clothes, his movements stiff and deliberate. He lay down on the far edge of the mattress, his body rigid, a wall of muscle and restraint. The space between them felt charged, a live wire. He could feel the heat of her, smell the faint scent of lavender from her hair. He lay on his back, staring into the darkness, listening to the sound of her breathing. Hours passed. The house settled around them. A chill crept into the room. He felt more than saw her shiver beside him. The protective instinct was a physical force, a command he could not ignore. He didn't move. He wouldn't, not without permission. His voice was a low rasp in the dark. "May I?" She was silent for a long moment. He thought she might be asleep. Then a whispered yes. Slowly, carefully, he reached for the edge of the quilt and drew it up, tucking it gently around her shoulders. His fingers brushed her arm, and a jolt went through him, sharp and stunning. He pulled his hand back as if burned. He had offered a vow of safety, and he would keep it, even from himself. The shared bed was a territory of careful negotiations. Eliza woke each morning to find Silas already gone, the space beside her cool, but for the faint impression of his body in the mattress. He was a ghost in her nights, a man so determined to give her space that he barely seemed to inhabit his own. She respected his restraint, was grateful for it, but a part of her, a part she had thought long dead, felt a strange pang of disappointment. She was safe, yes, but she was also still alone, even lying beside him. She was the one who had insisted on this arrangement, and she would not show weakness. But the loneliness was a different kind now. It was the ache of proximity without connection. She knew the hardness of his hands from the tools he gripped, but not the feel of them on her skin. She knew the sound of his breathing in the dark, but not the cadence of his laughter. The emotional doors between them remained closed, bolted by his honor and her fear. One evening, as a soft rain whispered against the roof, they sat in the main room. The fire cast a warm, flickering light, creating a bubble of intimacy in the quiet house. She was sewing, and he was oiling a piece of tack, the scent of leather and linseed filling the air. It was a comfortable silence, the kind shared by people who have grown accustomed to each other's presence. She decided to unbolt a lock. "My first husband," she began, her voice quiet but steady, "was a man like Mr. Thorne. He believed that a marriage license was a bill of sale." Silas's hands stilled. He did not look at her, but his entire being was focused on her, listening. He liked to make promises in public and break them in private. He did not value my opinion. She kept her gaze on her needlework, her stitches small and tight. "When he died, I used what little money I had to come west. I wanted a place where my choices were my own, where I was not a possession." She finally looked up. Silas was watching her, his gray eyes dark with an emotion she couldn't quite name. It wasn't pity. It was something harder, something fiercely protective. He set aside the piece of leather and leaned forward slightly, his forearms on his knees. "I was a lawman once," he said, his voice a low gravel, "in a town that had forgotten what law was. I saw men use their strength, their power, to take what they wanted. I saw what it did to people." He looked down at his own large, calloused hands as if they were foreign objects. "I left. I came here to build things, not break them. He met her gaze again. Your choices will always be your own here, Eliza. I swear it. In that lamplit room, with the rain murmuring its secrets outside, they exchanged their pasts like fragile, invaluable gifts. She saw the honorable man, and he saw the courageous survivor. She reached out, her fingers hesitant, and laid her hand over his on the table. His skin was rough, warm. He did not pull away. He simply turned his hand over and let his fingers close gently around hers. It was not a gesture of passion, but of profound, grounding connection. The door was unlocked. The story of their sudden marriage spread through redemption like a grass fire. Mr. Thorne, however, was not a man to be deterred by a piece of paper. He saw their union for what it was, a shield, and he was determined to break it. He began a campaign of subtle harassment. He disputed the boundary line of Silas's property, claiming a small but vital section that included the well. He appeared at the general store whenever Eliza was there, his presence a constant, smirking reminder of his intentions. He spoke of her as that poor woman, trapped in a loveless marriage with a brutish recluse. Silas absorbed it all with a stony patience that Eliza found both admirable and maddening. He would not be baited. When Thorne and his lawyer presented him with a survey document, Silas merely glanced at it. "The line is where it has always been," he said calmly, and went back to his work. But the pressure was mounting. The whispers in town grew louder. Thorne was poisoning the well of public opinion, painting Silas as a possessor and Eliza as a victim. One afternoon, Thorne confronted them as they were leaving the church. He stepped directly into Eliza's path, his smile oily. "Mrs. Kent," he said, drawing out the title with mocking emphasis, "I trust your husband is treating you well? You only have to say the word, and I can have this arrangement annulled. A woman like you deserves more than a blacksmith's charity." Before Eliza could speak, Silas moved. He didn't touch Thorne. He simply stepped between them, placing himself as a shield. His hand came to rest on the small of Eliza's back, a light but firm pressure. It was both a comfort to her and a clear, unmistakable declaration to Thorne. "She is with me. My wife and I are going home," Silas said, his voice flat, devoid of heat, but carrying the immense weight of his conviction. His eyes met Thorne's, and in that silent clash, a battle was fought and won. Thorne saw no anger, no fear, nothing he could use. He saw only an immovable object. Silas's gaze never left Thorne's as he guided Eliza past him. The touch on her back was a steady, grounding force. It was not the grip of an owner, but the supportive hand of a partner. In that public square, before the watching eyes of the town, he had made his choice clear. He was not just her protector. He was her husband, in truth, if not in fact. He stood with her, and in his quiet, unshakable solidarity, she felt a bond stronger than any vow spoken before a preacher. The confrontation Thorne had sought came not in the public square, but on their own land. He rode out to the homestead late one afternoon, 2 hired men flanking him, a sheaf of papers in his hand. Eliza was on the porch, shelling peas into a large bowl in her lap. The rhythmic snap and pop was the only sound until the thud of hooves broke the peace. Silas was at the forge, the steady ring of his hammer a comforting backdrop to her day. The sound stopped. Thorne dismounted, leaving his men by the fence line. He strode onto the porch as if he owned it, his shadow falling over her. "Eliza," he said, dispensing with the formalities, "this has gone on long enough. Your late husband, it turns out, was in considerable debt to my family's business. These papers give me a lien on his estate." He let the word hang in the air. "Which, as his widow, is now you." Eliza's blood ran cold. It was a lie, a fabrication, but a dangerous one. "I have nothing," she said, her voice tight. "You have this land. Or rather, he does," Thorne sneered, nodding toward the silent smithy. and I am prepared to forgive this debt in exchange for your cooperation. You will leave him and come work in my home, as we first discussed." Just then, Silas emerged from the forge, wiping his hands on a rag. He wasn't hurrying. His movements were deliberate, calm. He walked to the porch and stood beside her chair, his presence a silent counterpoint to Thorne's blustering. He didn't look at the papers. He looked at Eliza. It was her choice, her voice. He would be her shield, but she would wield the sword. Eliza set the bowl of peas aside. She stood, her spine straight, her gaze never leaving Thorne's. "There is no debt," she said, her voice as clear and hard as winter ice. "And there is no arrangement. You are not welcome here. This is my home." Thorne's face mottled with rage. He shoved the papers at her. "You will regret this." Silas's hand moved then, not with violence, but with an incredible swift calm. He took the papers from Thorne's hand before they could touch her. He didn't read them. He simply methodically tore them in half and then in quarters and let the pieces drift to the porch floor. "Leave," Silas said. It was not a shout. It was a low, final command, colder and harder than any iron he had ever forged. Thorne, faced with their united front, her unyielding will, and his immovable strength, was defeated. He sputtered, cursed, and finally retreated, his hired men following him like dogs. Silas waited until the sound of their horses had faded. Then he turned, latched the front door with a quiet click, and looked at Eliza. In his eyes, she saw not the relief of a battle won, but the deep, steady glow of devotion. They had chosen each other. The latch clicking shut was the loudest sound Silas had ever heard. It sealed them in, and the world out. The adrenaline of the confrontation drained away, leaving a tremor in its wake. He turned from the door and saw that Eliza's hands were trembling, her knuckles white where she gripped the back of the chair. The sight broke through his stoicism like a hammer through glass. All the words he didn't have, all the reassurances he didn't know how to speak, coalesced into a single desperate need to offer comfort. He crossed the space between them and, without thinking, took her hands in his. They were ice cold. He chafed them gently, his rough, warm palms enveloping hers. He was clumsy, his touch unpracticed, but it was earnest. "I don't know how to be gentle," he murmured, the admission a raw, painful confession. Her gaze lifted to his, and she saw the vulnerability he kept so carefully hidden. Then she looked down at their joined hands. "You are," she whispered. "You are." He noticed then a tiny, bright bead of blood on the tip of her index finger where she had pricked herself with her sewing needle, forgotten in the tumult. A wave of tenderness, so fierce it almost buckled his knees, washed over him. He led her to the kitchen basin, his grip on her hand still firm, grounding. He pumped fresh, cool water and washed the tiny wound with a surgeon's care, his large fingers surprisingly deft. He dried it with a clean cloth, and then, from a small tin, took a dab of salve and smoothed it over the mark before wrapping it in a thin strip of linen. He did it all in silence, his head bent, his focus absolute. The act was so intimate, so deeply caring, it felt more profound than any kiss. They ate supper later in the quiet glow of the kitchen lamplight. The food was simple bread, cheese, the peas she had shelled, but it felt like a feast. The shared silence was no longer a space of caution, but one of deep, abiding peace. He had tended to her wound. He had stood with her. He had helped her claim their home. He reached across the table, his fingers brushing the back of her hand where it rested on the wood. She didn't pull away. "Eliza," he said, her name spoken softly, a question and a vow all in one. It was the first time he had said it with such open, unguarded warmth. She turned her hand over and laced her fingers with his. "Silas," she answered, her own name for him a promise returned. The fortress had become a home. In the days that followed, The house settled into a new rhythm. The space between them on the bed at night shrank, not with passion, but with the easy comfort of belonging. One morning Eliza woke to find his arm draped over her waist, his hand resting lightly on her hip, his breathing a slow, steady rumble against her back. He had reached for her in his sleep, an unconscious act of possession that felt not like ownership, but like a homecoming. She lay still, savoring the solid, reassuring weight of him, the simple, profound fact of his presence. Their life was a tapestry woven from small, quiet gestures. He began leaving a single wildflower, a bit of Indian paintbrush or a purple aster, by her place at the breakfast table each morning. She took to mending his clothes as if they were her own, the act of stitching the warm fabric, a quiet devotion. The house was no longer his, or a temporary shelter for her. It was theirs. The orderly routines that had once been a bulwark against his loneliness were now shared rituals that bound them together. One evening, she came out to the smithy where he was working late, the fire casting his powerful form in silhouette. He was carving a small block of wood. She watched him, his brow furrowed in concentration, his large hands working with surprising delicacy. When he was finished, he held it out to her. It was a small, intricately carved finch, its head cocked as if listening. The detail was perfect. It was a thing of beauty, created by hands more used to shaping iron. She took it, the smooth wood warm in her palm. It was not a gift of courtship. It was a piece of himself. "For the mantle," he said gruffly, already turning back to his work, uncomfortable with the emotion of the moment. She carried the small bird inside and placed it on the mantelpiece, right beside the ticking clock. It was a promise of a future, a symbol of the life they were building, piece by quiet piece. Later, she found him on the porch, staring out at the twilight sky. She stood beside him, her shoulder brushing his. "I was thinking of planting a garden," she said, "by the south wall. For vegetables." He nodded, considering it. "The soil is good there. I could build you a raised bed. Keep the rabbits out. And the porch swing," she added, her voice soft. "The chain is rusted. I can forge a new one," he said. They weren't just words about chores. They were blueprints. They were speaking of a future, of seasons to come, of a life to be shared in this place. He turned to her, the last light of day catching the earnest, serious expression in his eyes. He reached out, his thumb gently tracing her jawline. "I will keep you warm," he said, a plain, simple vow holding all the poetry she would ever need. "You are safe here." She leaned into his touch, closing her eyes, a true, unguarded smile finally gracing her lips. "I know," she whispered. "I'm home."